Can you just press that button?
Yeah, just you can watch that.
Put them there.
For POIs, I would prefer if you wave rather than verbally interrupt. During one of the scariest economic episodes that the world is experiencing, a war, a pandemic, high commodity prices, high levels of debt, this is functionally the worst time ever to try and implement austerity. Our case on opening government is extremely simple. This is going to lead to massive economic slowdown in countries that are going to be horrible for them and trigger a global economic crisis, or at the very least, a slowdown. Some setup, why is going to slow economic growth and its impact on that? On setup, firstly, we are going to remove all current conditions except for anti-corruption things. Secondly, we are going to do this so long as current economic conditions proceed, probably throughout the pandemic, probably until the invasion ends. In general, we are just against conditionalized loans. We think if conditionalized loans have to be implemented, now is the worst time to ensure for that. I want to start with some characterization about what the global economic context currently is. Firstly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine means that it's becoming prohibitively more expensive for developing countries to do things like import a variety of food, given that Ukraine was often involved in supply chains. Secondly, commodity prices are lower than they were, so relatively high, making it a lot more expensive for countries to do things like import gas, which is very important to sustaining businesses. And thirdly, there's still massive aftershocks of the pandemic. There can be new waves. Countries might still need to do things like have quarantines and be able to shut down. There's still things like supply chain shocks that are ultimately existing. There's still often debt as a result of state spending and stuff like that. So the economy is pretty bad. How are these conditions going to slow down the economy? I want to discuss this in 3 different ways. The most basic way is that market-based reforms are often about correcting for the budget deficit. What this functionally means are decreasing state spending and increasing forms of taxation that's going to exist. This is a huge problem because all of these policies usually slow down demand within the domestic economy. If taxes are higher, consumers have less money to go to small businesses and to buy things that often sustain the larger economy. When you're removing the budget deficit via decreasing subsidies to corporations that are going to accrue, they have less money to be able to sustain their operations. This is extremely powerful by the money multiplier that tends to exist. That is, even a small degree of increased state spending within the economy trickles down a long way because you use your money to hire someone else. When you hire someone else, you're able to buy more food. That supports a corporation and it functionally happens in a cyclical way. I want to preempt that states might be bad at spending. Firstly, this is often money directly in the hands of people. When you're doing things like lowering taxes, it is people have more money to be able to spend in ways that are meaningful for them. It's often about subsidies that are vital in sustaining my ability to buy bread, and then that frees up more money for me to be able to do other things. Secondly though, even if states spend in shit ways, it functionally doesn't matter. I'd rather have a government spending money to help their SOE because the SOE is still part of the state economic engine. That SOE still employs people. That SOE still exports oil to other states. That's vital in acquiring forms of GDP that tend to exist. Secondly though, this will harm the economy because you need to spend more money buying international currency reserves. They're just expensive, especially given that other currencies are often more appreciated relative to your own currency, and then you have less money to spend for the people. Thirdly, most importantly, floating your currency right now is one of the worst ideas in history. There's a lot of developing countries who have a peg to a more stable currency or a basket of currencies like the dollar or the euro. When you have a poor economic foundation, because they already have a lot of debt as it currently stands, they already have less money to engage in terms of spending, that's going to place massive inflationary pressures on their currency, which is what's going to happen in other countries like Egypt when they try to float their currency. This is really bad because we have huge inflation. This is terrible for individuals' quality of life within the country itself, given that contracts often can't keep up with inflation because wages are often fixed. But more importantly, it often leads to things like capital flight. Why? No, who's going to want to do business in a country where you functionally have to hold a currency that is now relatively worthless, like within your own business coffers? Know that all these things also are likely to trigger a cycle of declining economic conditions as well. Because even if only a couple businesses are hard, even if spending slightly decreases, all these lower things like economic indicators, and given that a lot of economic stability functions on the basis of speculation and how investors and other people perceive your economy to be, there's all mechanisms where we can get things like capital flight. Before I give 7 impacts, let's look back out.
So why are countries dumb enough to accept the lines then?
Because they need money, because they have a lot of debt, and they have to pay back other creditors. They are desperate, and people are starving, and they want to not have a political crisis that's going to exist. I think that functionally their alternatives are either worse, i.e. China, who has more conditions on loans, or they're just extremely desperate, and therefore think this at the end of the day. Why is it bad then to trigger a degree of economic crisis? First, the quality of life of people just goes down. Even if people leave no other impacts, then there won't be an economic crisis. Things like having money to buy bread and fertilizer, if you're living in the bottom 10% of your city, is a clear impact. But more importantly, when all these factors trigger a wider slowdown things like unemployment. Secondly, though, it's more likely to trigger a sovereign debt crisis that's going to exist within a lot of states. When economic fundamentals weaken, it is harder to tap into international credit markets because people are only going to be willing to buy the bonds of your country at the point where they think that there's a viable chance that those bonds are actually going to be paid back. And at the point where that's more difficult, because things like state reserves are decreasing because the economy in general is doing worse, people are less likely to loan you money. So either you get fewer bonds, but the bonds that you do get have more extorted interest rates, which is so bad because you have less money to be able to spend for other things. And increased likelihood of a debt crisis matters a lot because A, it's bad for your country's credit reputation. It makes it harder to tap into international credit markets going into the future. And number two, there's a larger degree of economic interconnectedness between different countries. So even if you think that our cases like extreme, and only one or two countries, this is like the tipping point for them, like Sri Lanka during a pandemic, given that banks often hold money in other banks within other countries, given that there's often interconnected trade relations, the economy of one country decreases and has massive trickle-down effects to the economies in other states. Thirdly, the economy going down means that you're going to have to need more loans from the IMF going into the future. Because if there is an economic contraction, that means that people are poor. If people are poor, do you know what that means? Your country needs even more money. So I think that if you don't have austerity, it's not likely that you're just going to need one or two loans from the IMF, or on the other side of the house, you get more of like a Pakistan type scenario, where you need to keep going back to the IMF 7 times, which prevents any potential argument that the institutions are going to want to lend out money because there was like less conditions. The point is, you need less than 2 loans in the first place. The fourth reason why this is so important is that this could like trigger a political crisis when the economy goes down. Like look at what happened with Sri Lanka at the beginning of the pandemic. When people do things like lose access to their subsidies, they go to the streets because they're angry, they're upset, and they're hungry. This is not going to trigger things like the downfalls of entire governments, which is important because you can't have any policy advocacy. You can't do things like treat the pandemic. You can't even pass basic budgets when governments are constantly cycling this going to exist. Things like strikes are often extremely bad for the economy, given that businesses often cease to operate in this capacity. Fifthly, though, this means that in the future, this is going to decrease the legitimacy of the IMF and push people toward worse alternatives. This is both because they might be forced to go to other alternatives if they simply cannot afford this, thereby preempting what we hear from closing opposition, or they just don't hate the IMF because they blame them for worsening their quality of life in a critical juncture when individuals are already suffering, meaning that it's more likely that they're going to have to seek out other loans from like China and other institutions. Why is this worse? Firstly, even if you don't think that China is like a worse actor in a vacuum, even though they often just do charging like exorbitant interest rates, that gives like countries like China a lot more bargaining power over how they issue loans. Because I think it's good under the status quo that we were able to shop around, possibly go to the IMF, possibly go to China, because I can see more bargaining power between the two institutions, and there you can push for things like lower interest rates as a developing country. If now you're more desperate, you can only go to China, the function makes them a monopoly over loans provision, meaning that like clauses in the loans over like you're going to be able to seize more of your collateral, we're going to be able to charge you high interest rates, become a lot more worse. But secondly, I would just posit that China is often a worse actor in general, because they often have things like we're going to seize more of your ports. They often care less about conformity to like global norms when it comes to interest rates, and therefore just jack them up substantially more. For all of these reasons, I'm extremely proud to stage my opening go.
I thank the speaker very much for a wonderful speech, and it's my pleasure to call upon the Leader of Opposition to open against their side. Thank you.
The strategy from OG I found quite peculiar, and the reason is it just creates an overwhelming degree of symmetry in the round. Will their policies actually correct isn't really answered, so it makes it very easy, given the defensiveness of their case, to just suggest simply that countries need these measures to resuscitate a dying economy. I'll do a couple of things. First, ref, mostly integrated though, in two arguments. One, on why removing these conditions increases debt massively, increasing the risk of default and all of the other bad things this round. Second, on why money is loaned to countries that cannot pay it back, and why that means that the IMF becomes less effective going forward. In terms of refutation to the prof case now, the first thing I want to note is I want to suggest that the way that the supply chains exist right now isn't mean that it's going to be permanently and forever economically devastating for these countries. There is a way out, and the reason is that substitution effects are relatively strong. Things like OPEC not listening to the demands of Russia, countries instituting caps, for example, means that the degree of economic rehabilitation that is being worked towards from the international community is relatively effective. They also say that these types of this type of money is really important because it goes towards things like cash transfers to individuals. This is far too generic a stance, given that this is about particularly financial decisions that are being made by countries and are being made toward reducing budgetary deficits. It seems like spending massively is probably a negative way of trying to correct for that harm, but more than that, it's just not not clear whether or not giving money actually solves, given that presumably the inflow of more and more money into the economy only worsens inflationary spirals. But more than that, I think that the claim on floating is actually quite meaningful, given that these austerity measures are particularly directed toward the collection of currency reserves, which can correct for this, given that you're pegged to currencies that are far less volatile. Furthermore, their claim on interconnectedness. I think this is solved for by regulation that already exists, which reduces the degree of exposure of banks and other countries to any given financial institution, and country for that matter, which means that the degree of harm they can claim for that is very, very small. I'll return to China in the arguments then. First argument on why removing these conditions increases debt massively. The first thing I want to point out is that high rates of quantitative easing and high spending are very, very likely on their side, and we get no reason why that isn't the case. In fact, we get arguments that suggest that there is going to be higher spending on citizens, which presumably actually doesn't fix things. A couple of reasons to note why is the case then that they are unlikely to get any sorts of solvency in terms of the economic problems that they highlight. One, there's a strong degree of in developing countries of a need to pander toward voters in the capacity to dole out cash. That means that it's very, very difficult for countries to make economic decisions that are in the interest of citizens. And another reason is that the frequent histories of socialism that permeate lots of these countries means that their societies and their governmental systems are often geared towards those types of policies, which trade off necessarily the types of capitalist policies that are probably necessary. But third, and this is most important, connections with wealthy elite classes are really important and affect the stability of developing countries because their buy-in is necessary toward the stability of government. So fertilizer subsidies, for example, are only really valuable at scale. So these are the types of policies that are particularly designed to benefit the wealthiest classes. So that is why it is very difficult in their world to actually implement policies in the first place that are necessary toward alleviating suffering. No thanks. This takes these economies down because industries massively are struggling. The IMF imposing these sorts of measures, though, actually corrects for the high amount of debt, and there are a few reasons. One, it gives the political capital necessary for politicians to get away with implementing these policies in the first place. So they can blame the IMF for tying their hands and forcing them to impose necessary policies on their citizens. And this anticipates the response of a legitimacy crisis from opening government, because free conditions mean governments cannot access these narratives in the first place. That when politicians claiming to pander and represent the citizens on the ground can no longer apply that same degree of pressure, because fundamentally it was never the Prime Minister's decision in the first place. So the cases where governments are relatively weak, for example, and where citizens are most at risk are especially important because this foregoes any sort of legitimacy crisis that they might individually incur by suggesting that it's the international community that is forcing them to take these actions in the first place. Second, we would suggest that conditions actually encourage market confidence, and that suggests that money increases at a huge, huge rate. And the reason is emerging markets are actually quite attractive towards investors. The reason being that they have burgeoning industries, and more than that, that there's just a huge upside toward the minimal amount of capital that you could either input in the first place. So the capacity for gain is very, very high. So investment then is a risk-reward calculation. The problem is, in their side, they massively inflate the risks that investors perceive in investing in otherwise possibly stable or long-term possibly fruitful countries, because they suggest that the only thing that matters, or they give complete will to these countries to make every single decision. So this is really important, and it fixes a key problem which demonstrates sufficiency. The reason being that wealthier people now are benefited too because more money is coming in the first place. This increases money a lot, and that is important in the short term because it means you're able to pay off the huge amounts of debts that you have collected and frees up long-term money for spending on people. No thanks. Third, IMF is likely to increase interest rates on their loans should they be doled out in their world because there are no conditions on it virtually. That means that the default risk skyrockets because you have to pay much, much more in a short period of time. But second, it means the turn to China in their world is actually far more likely. The reason being that China offers you loans at high rates, yes, but if comparable to the IMF with even fewer restrictions, you probably end up picking China more often and more frequently in their world. The impact here is very simple. Your life is really, really difficult in a world that is affected by spiraling debt, etc. So that means that you are worse off in a world where that debt continues to provide you no solvency.
If your criticism is that a lot of this money goes towards wealthy elites, then why were they putting restrictions on farming and fertilizer subsidies?
Yeah, that was way at the top. It was that fertilizer subsidies exist at scale, and that benefits elites. Second argument, money is loaned to countries that cannot pay it back. A lot of countries that are given loans in the world of government will not be able to pay it back. There are inflationary spirals that happen when tons and tons of money flows into your economy. There's a lack of policy. And importantly, right, there are people on both sides of the political aisle. There's a slow amount of time, or it takes a long amount of time to make decisions on what types of policies you want to implement in the first place. That short-term delay in policies actually getting applied is really, really important for the effectiveness and the capacity of countries to actually contain the extent of debt crisis that they face. So, more countries end up getting access to their loans on their side, admittedly. This is bad, one, because it trades off with IMF loan programs just existing, right? There's a huge loss of money that comes when countries struggle to pay back IMF loans and end up defaulting at a higher rate. Second, countries that make up the IMF end up not wanting to devote as much money to the IMF. There are two scenarios here. Either the US, in an attempt to gain legitimacy, continues to exist in the IMF and devotes their money largely, and other countries don't at a high rate, which means your basically sole debtor is the US, and they are the only country that actually gets to dictate the types of economic policies that are made, which is probably worse. But second, I just think lots of countries on the that exist in the IMF just start rolling back their contributions, giving much less money, which means the IMF as an institution is much less effective. I think this is important because obviously the IMF is important, right? They give a ton of money to countries, they can insulate them from the possible risks of debt and inflationary spirals, which means that countries that desperately need their money can get access to it. In their world, the IMF becomes far less effective and doesn't have the capacity to be able to provide these policies in the first place. On that basis, I propose.
Hi, thank you for this fantastic speech, and she first spoke on the Deputy Prime Minister. Can you get to the side? Get his.
Even if OO does not like non-market policies, the reality is that these policies are deeply entrenched and do not just subsidize elites. The most dangerous default risk that exists in this debate is exposing countries at the moment of the largest economic vulnerability and at the moment where they are most reliant on the particular mix of currency subsidization, subsidies for various industries, etc., to markets which will immediately arbitrage and wreck their currencies, imposing interest rates that are punitive on these states. We propose. The first thing I want to do is explain why the IMF is still going to be strong and still have a lot of buy-in, even in a world where we don't attach conditions. Their argument is twofold. Number one, the IMF will lose a lot of money. For one, I think that there will be some additional money coming because a larger number of developing countries will succeed in the long term at becoming wealthier and becoming middle-income countries, and in turn, because they were never imposed to conditions, will not normatively dislike the IMF as much, their voters will not reject it as much, and funding will be more politically palatable. But that is a smaller response compared to the fact that the IMF has never been about income on loans. Almost all its loans are given at prime rates, and in particular, countries in the IMF that fund it gain power and voting rights at the IMF based on sheer contribution size. There is also a balance that is readjusted every once in a while, depending again on contribution size and geopolitical size. The implication of this is as follows. You never want to cut your contributions to the IMF because then you have less power over how they are doled out. And you are still significantly exposed to how they are doled out, given OO's own argument, which implies there's very little incentive to be a first mover country and pull your funding away from the IMF. But I also think their argument on higher interest rates makes zero sense. The threat of losing money to Chinese expansionism and One Belt One Road and other associated infrastructure-based projects are a reason why you won't make your interest rates very high. Now, their better version of that claim is that you're now exposed to a lot more risk in terms of the debt, so you're going to make rates higher. But the problem is the worst thing for countries is default risk. It is not that you make a little bit less money on interest, which implies that if countries know that there's a high risk of default from charging punitive interest rates, they will not in fact charge punitive interest rates because there are costs to restructuring debt that accrue to their country in the future. The people who decide this aren't politicians, they're bureaucrats, they know this, they're the IMF delegation, etc. Very, very unlikely. I will add as well that it is historically completely not true. The IMF was repurposed to give loans that had conditions in the 70s, when after the fall of Bretton Woods there was no more bureaucratic purpose for the IMF, but there were still lots of workers there, and they had to repurpose themselves. At the moment of the 1970s and 80s, that made sense. They turned into a mechanism to give loans and attach austerity conditions and do structural adjustment programs. But there is nothing inherent to the IMF to require conditionality. The IMF gave non-conditional loans to many developing world countries alongside the World Bank as it existed in the 1960s, with zero problem and much lower rates of default than happened in the 1970s. We moved towards structural adjustment. I will get into the structural reason for this in my second area, which is explaining why this is likely to cause an economic crisis. Before I go on, opening.
Isn't the implication of conditionality existing suggesting that countries that have huge amounts of voting rights desire austerity and conditionality as a contingency for their contributions in the first place?
I don't think it's true that governments want to tie their hands in this way. Maybe in a limited number of cases, their claim is right, and governments can say, I get to impose austerity now because the IMF is forcing my hand. The problem is this is a theoretical claim, and if you look on the ground, this is not true. In Pakistan, a government is about to be toppled because basically of the fact of default associated with high levels of conditions. In Sri Lanka, a foreign exchange crisis was caused in part because governments were unable to pay off their debt associated with conditionality. In the immediate preceding present right now, we are seeing a high level of geopolitical strife, and in particular, a high level of countries who directly due to their involvement in structural adjustment policies have had major economic problems. Their secondary claim on this is that a lot of the policies governments will do are because of bad incentives, and for some reason, because fertilizer scales, they're not giving money to lots of people for subsidies. I think one, this is just empirically ignorant of what is going on. In Sri Lanka, the entire thing was over a fuel subsidy program that affected literally every single person at the gas pump. Very often this has been appeasing important rural constituencies that matter due to the fact of their geographic importance because of the way that political ridings function that tend to give larger degrees of control to rural areas. So very often this ends up being a thing that benefits individual people, particularly lobbies that are quite large, like farmers, like people who work in the trades that make up the large number of poor people in the country. But second of all, I think that countries, even when they have a loan, have a sufficient level of independence, a sufficient level of incentive, that means that they probably won't do bad things. This means even without conditions, the very fact of having a loan is important. Why? Historically, many developing countries have had governments topple in significant backlash to a perception that they were not managing debt loads from foreign creditors well. That means you don't want to default on the loans because this could trigger a political crisis. Newspapers and opposition will say you spent irresponsibly. So this is very important. Having a loan is the important thing. The conditions that are attached to the loan, in fact, look bad, because the rhetoric is now, they have sold out to the foreign government, they are Western. That is literally what Imran Khan is saying to the current Pakistani government in his bid to get back in power and saying we don't want this element of conditionality. Why is the economic slowdown incredibly likely? I think what Naomi proves is that even small degrees of economic slowdown that happen when you remove stimulus from countries that are not yet over the pandemic, that have major supply shocks as a problem, the only response is to say some supply chains can pivot. I think this is hard, number one, because there are massive sanction loads around the world that have to do with Russia. Countries are facing a cap, for example, on the price of Russian fuel. Many countries can't pivot their supply chains easily, but also because years of globalization structurally mean that supply chains are highly optimized and mean that finished goods, as they're made across the world, go through many, many different areas for very particular parts of a component or of a supply chain, like services, accounting, or whatever, which means it's very hard to pivot supply chains into the long run. Also, doing this requires money, which you need to get from loans. Pivoting your supply chains implies massive reinvestment, building new ports, building new universities, etc. And this stuff is more likely to occur on our side of the house. Their last claim under this is that there's going to be a high likelihood of default because states are unlikely to pay back. I'm willing to concede in a very, very low number of cases that there is a slight higher likelihood of default into the long term. I still think this is worth it. For one, countries are able to get themselves out of a heavy, heavy moment of geopolitical weakness and economic weakness right now. That means into the long run, they're able to take advantage of everything that everyone points about the multiplier effect of a growing economy to get out of the crisis and emerge stronger. If there is a likelihood of default catching up to states in the future, they'll be better equipped to solve it. Why? Because the economy will become larger. It will be more stable. That means that if they have to raise taxes to pay off default, or if they find it harder to raise money in the future, they'll have a lower need because they were able to get the money now at a moment of need. But second of all, in the future, Western governments will be less overstretched. They won't be facing a fuel crisis. They won't be facing Ukraine. So they will be able to afford to be more generous in terms of rearranging debt, even if it didn't have conditions. Which implies that even in their literal worst case in the future, where there's a higher risk of default in the future, and we manage better on our side of the house, we'll have gotten the money to countries at the moment when they need it. What is the implication of this? We think that these conditions, even if they achieve some market reforms, are not good market reforms. If you float an interest rate, that exposes a huge amount of risk to a country where for a long time they have massaged currency values and interest rates. That means people will very much struggle because their wealth will immediately erode overnight and be subject to arbitrage and foreign traders. The Asian financial crisis happened when a peg was removed and it was exposed to fluctuations emerging from floating interest rates and foreign speculators who poured hot money into their country. That is what countries are rife for at a moment of geopolitical instability. We are very proud to propose.
Wonderful speech, and it is my pleasure to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition, so I'll start this debate. We're here.
Do you guys mind just running to the bathroom really quickly? It'll take like 10 seconds.
Go for it.
I'll alright, check it, so you're outside.
I know. Oh, I thought that we were supposed to wait for him.
Yeah.
Wait, we're not leaving?
Well, why would you tell me this?
I do know.
I did.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
The shadow of colonialism has ravaged Latin America for decades now. It is absurd for OG to say that it is always good to increase spending and that always allows countries to get out of poverty. Rather, I think it's pretty intuitive in the round that countries must strike a balance between spending and restraining debt. This question is about which side is better able to find that balance. OG is trying to duck this burden by saying, oh, but this is a time of crisis, this is a really bad time to impose austerity, but their burden is to support this in perpetuity as opposed to just right now. What the IMF is doing right now, and why it's removed these conditions, is because in response to the crisis they're talking about, they have lent more and become over-leveraged. In order to make sure that this does not wreck their ability to make this money back and send investors fleeing, we must impose conditions and at least reassure investors. The response we got from Max is that, well, obviously the IMF will continue to function and countries will still buy in. Three responses to this. The first thing is, I think it's strange to claim that you won't pull out because the contributions that you make are a condition for you to access loans in the future. The reason for this is that countries that borrow from the IMF are predominantly ones that are relatively low income, as opposed to the US, as opposed to EU, Germany, Spain, etc. For those reasons, I think the biggest investors are very much concerned about the IMF's ability to continue to make money because they don't need the loans that they're using as leverage. This is also true of hedge funds, private investors, so on and so forth. We're not saying the IMF stops functioning, but we are saying it becomes more difficult for them to make money, and therefore they then end up loaning to fewer countries in the future, and also that they increase interest rates in response to all of this, and that's not great. Okay, three clashes today. The first clash is, to what extent do IMF loans restrict spending? Because this is not about restrict without having some government spending versus having zero government spending. Rather, it's about reducing government spending and whether this is going to be effective at striking the balance. I think there are two reasons why the IMF is good at striking the balance that reduces unnecessary expansionary spending while making sure that average people can continue to make a living and basically survive. The reason for this, as they themselves characterize, the IMF wants the money to be paid back. For those reasons, if the government informs them that there are certain subsidy programs that they need in order to keep the government crashing and burning, then they're unlikely to impose that restriction onto them, or they will factor that into the contract. Because remember that the IMF does not just rock up and say, here's the standardized set of policies that every single country must follow, because that would be hugely catastrophic and every country is different. Rather, there is a negotiation process between the country and between the IMF. This is likely to go well, just because I think the IMF, as they say, is also concerned about their reputation and has changed over the past few decades. But the second main reason for this is because there is a large amount of government spending that is unnecessary. So a lot of subsidies, for example, are regressive as opposed to progressive because it is far easier for middle class or wealthy individuals, for example, wealthy landowners who have large farms and therefore proportionally benefit more from fertilizer to access this. This is especially true because it costs a shit ton of money to enter parts of the country that are especially poor, and because of limited government capacity, spending is mostly restricted to relatively wealthy areas. For those reasons then, I think that likely comparative is we restrict, we trim the fat while maintaining the systems that are necessary for growth. The second clash I want to talk about is just compare both sides' methods of controlling debt. Because OG's method is basically to describe expansionary economic policy to us for 7 minutes. Like, their case is literally, given that that we have more money, one, we get trickle-down economics, two, therefore investors like you and give you money, and three, that you end up being able to pay your debt QED. Like, all I need to do then is challenge the first premise that you therefore have more money and that this actually ends up stimulating the economy and leading to constructive growth. 4 responses to this. 1. The money that you give to the IMF is more effective on our side of the house than on their side of the house when we have restrictions and conditions on how to use this, especially when we do things like maximize, like make sure you have certain currency reserves and making sure that your currency remains stable in value. And the reason for this is because on their side of the house, a lot of this money is going towards debt servicing in the first place as opposed to going down to people. But the second main response for this is that the investor, like, it's not true that this is going to increase investors' investment in the long investment, because in the kind of economic climate that we have at the moment, in which there's high risk and investors don't have a shit ton of money to throw around, they're relatively risk averse, which means that they don't want to spend money on a country that might be able to take this money and succeed. They want guarantees that the shit shows that have happened time and time again, in which countries have taken IMF bailouts and blown them on politically palatable but ultimately unsuccessful programs, and I think that we are the side that is able to get this reassurance. The third reason for this, though, is because I'll take you guys later, is that this money goes primarily to elites, and I don't think that trickle-down economics really works. And the reason for this is like all the stuff that we've learned in Eco 100, right? That is, trickle-down economics presupposes that elites actually end up reinvesting the money that they receive, or when they earn money, that this leads to more jobs. The issue, though, is that oftentimes elites would prefer to hoard the money themselves. And this is especially true in this kind of economic context, in which there is a lot of uncertainty, and where you do live in a country where institutions aren't as strong as you would like. That's why China has a huge capital flight, because everyone wants to make money from business and then fuck off. Before I get any further, see.
Yeah, just so we're all clear, perhaps, what is the purpose of large international currency reserves?
In order to make sure their currency remains stable and you're able to continuously pay off debt. Okay, the fourth response then I have is that it's also the case that even if you're able to achieve greater economic activity, that this does not translate to ability to pay debt, because it is very difficult for these countries to collect tax. Because oftentimes they have very small narrow tax bases because of high inequality, which means that in order to make money from economic growth, they would have to impose very high taxes on these particular groups of people, which is A, politically unpopular, but B, also counterproductive towards their goals of stimulating economic growth. All of this is to say is that 1, they don't trigger economic growth, but 2, even if they do, this does not actually mean that you end up resolving the debt crisis. Let me deal with that then, because it's actually not very clear whether OG cares about reducing debt at all. Their best case and their goal seems to be just continue the status quo in perpetuity. However, this is deeply unsustainable because clearly you do need money, but number 2, it's the case that in their best case scenario, they're able to prevent some economic slowdown right now. However, in the long term, they keep on accumulating debt. I think it's way worse when governments cut spending programs because they have literally no money and cannot choose what to borrow and what not to borrow, or when they have a massive increase in inflation overall, and then your money becomes completely devalued, than the ability of your country to be selective about who you give money to and who you don't. For those reasons, vote OO.
Hi, thank you for the speech, and it is my pleasure to call upon the Member of Government to open second house of debate. Say here.
I'm going to begin on the POI I just gave. The issue with large international currency reserves is that they provide a false security and make other actors, because there's more people than just the IMF operating like global monetary and fiscal policy, but it's like the World Bank, like started, I think, unless it's changed job. Things like this that are all hugely important. And the incentives that change for these other actors are actually quite perverse and lead to a worse outcome than if we force those actors to do stability via other means. Because what do we hear is the purpose of large international currency reserves? It is to provide stability to the basic currency, but also, then this is another thing, to provide stability to the economy, right? Because if your currency collapses, but you have huge amounts of international currency reserves, it's not as big of a problem for outsiders because, well, you can still pay off your debts using the international currency reserves, and you can still engage in trade using those reserves. This is why, essentially, Sri Lanka was allowed to collapse, because it had large enough international currency reserves, just the collapse of its own currency did not matter as much. It's also why it's happened in Central America in the past and why many Central American countries now use the dollar. However, I want to discuss that because the issue then is that if you do not have this, well, the risk of all that sounds far worse, right? The risk of currencies to is far worse without this security, meaning other actors are forced to ensure stability of your currency via other means, to ensure that you avoid this nightmare scenario of a currency collapse plus no ability to pay off loans and still engage in trade. Why is this a hugely important incentive and what does it achieve? Well, it means actors like the World Bank, but also collaborative regional banks, whether they be like the EU Central Bank, not EU, it's just ECB, because not everyone's in the EU Eurozone, I always forget, with cool ones, whatever. Things like this, but also like the Shanghai Development Bank, like prospective projects such as the AU having the central bank together, but I also think like Southern Africa, they already have one, don't quote me on that. The crucial thing is that so far as it exists, and there's general international banks, what they do then is they can ensure that your currency does not collapse by continually increases its value whenever it seems like it is going too low. They don't want to do this generally to like fuck with your export economies and these kinds of things, but just to avoid collapse, that is the instance in when they do it. Why do they do it? Well, partially because it's their mandate. They're able to do it, and this is also another reason why they do it, because international actors who don't want one economy completely collapsing, no longer being able to pay off the debts that they may own to you, say America or China, but also just like contagion and economic trade and these kinds of things. They don't want you to collapse, essentially. But crucially, the capacity for the World Bank to do this is it can, say, buy bonds in your currency, but government bonds, rather than going straight to the central banks, because they do address the issue with quantitative easing. It is that ultimately, if your central bank is engaging in quantitative easing, it risks inflation. However, there's another way to go about it, because governments also give out bonds issued in their own national currency. And what you have to do then as an international actor to buy that bonds is to buy up a bunch of that currency, i.e. increase the demand for it, i.e. increase its value to avoid collapse. The reason why the World Bank and these other groups are able to do this is because they can then package that bond with other bonds from, say, Germany or other places, which make it a bit more viable and avoid the World Bank making an absolute loss in it, i.e. they pool risk to some extent. You're not able to do this with loans, and this is the issue with OO, because I think, well, the alternative is just loans. No, the alternative is this, because loans are often like essentially trustee relationships. So it has to go from one person to village to another, whereas a bond is a claim of ownership, and those can be exchanged on the bond markets and then pooled together to the same extent the way you can't do with loans. What is the power of this? Well, first of all, it just means you can keep indigenous currency quite stable and you can avoid collapse, even on our side of the house. But one of the best parts is that the way you do it is by giving the national government more money. Because I'm not sure how OG can ever afford continuing fuel subsidies, but this is how you can, if the World Bank is giving you the money to essentially do it. And also, I want to please tell the Indian farmers who protested that all farming subsidies just go to elites. I think the average informed voter knows that's not true. Crucially then, what are the overall impacts? A, because currency collapse is very, very bad, even in instances where you can continue trade. Because sure, Turkey is doing alright on the international trade markets, but people every day see the price of bread going up by like 100 lira every single day, and it's very hard to manage day to day, especially for those worse off. B, we give governments liquidity. Well, C, avoiding inflation. And D, ultimately, you need other things like loans and pointless increases on interest rates on those debts and these kinds of things are not needed because you can still have strong enough currency to pay off your debts. So that's how we've already won the debate. Let's win it in a different way. Before that, sure, they were confused, so you go.
Yeah, so just to clarify, that might all be very well and good, but why do you need to give so much money to fertilizer and fuel?
Fuel you use in all industry because industry requires energy. And energy often comes from fuel. If you are a small developing economy without, like, say, comparative advantage on technology, or maybe your climate isn't good enough to grow things easily, fertilizer helps. That's that. Right, I want to discuss collective action problems then. The thesis of this second point is that on their side, is if you cannot control interest rates and to some extent currency exchange rates, you force a race to the bottom as people with more capital in these countries themselves seek to invest when they would have done so anyway, and and then ultimately resulting in less investment on the long term, thus less liquidity and these kinds of things. So how do we say avoid this in the status quo? So you peg exchange. No, thank you. You peg exchange to encourage the purchase of your imports, right? So you have a relatively low exchange to say the dollar if they're the ones who buy your imports, buy your exports technically, but also it makes sure you get basic stability like OG do identify to be fair to them. But secondly, you make sure your own central bank sets very high interest rates because that encourages investment because you can get a loan in this country then and well guess what? The interest rate is quite good, which gives some of the security that they pointed out is often missing because at least if your loan is at an interest rate you feel a little bit more safe going and investing in that area. But secondly, it just means like the investment will cost you less in the long term because it's a better idea to invest there. The reason why they're able to do this to some extent is the reason why these countries then have the capacity to all agree to set very high interest rates altogether is first of all because they're just like economic unions in these areas which like actively physically agree on these things. They say, oh, we in the African Union will all have very high interest rates to encourage this kind of thing and we can always have that as an actual agreement and we will like say we'll give that mandate then to our own individual central banks. Because what happens on there, and then crucially people will still invest to some extent despite this because you have leverage via cheap labour and resources. But they reduce the incentive to invest by reducing these mechanisms. Because what happens? Indigenous banks, who are not central banks but are small individual banks, well they don't want to be giving out these huge interest rates, right? They want to like make more money on their loans that they give out. So they lower it down each individually. Because at least these countries doing it together have an obviously dominant proof strategy, and that's the Schengen lecture that you guys need to watch. It's like better than actual workshops. They ultimately know, well, we as a few countries can do this, but a bunch of small individual banks within each country are not as trustworthy, and thus you have lowering and lowering interest rates, meaning less of an incentive to invest in these countries, meaning less development, but also less liquidity within these economies to ensure the payments of these things and paying off loans. I have never been prouder to have case filed economics for once finally for a major season and for it to have gone well.
Thank you very much for an excellent speech, and it's my pleasure to call upon the member of opposition to continue the case by side. Go ahead.
We're not comparing against a hypothetical in this today. We know one thing for sure. These countries don't have a lot of money. These governments aren't good at policies that lead to them getting money, which sets the bar pretty low for this opposition bench. Because what you don't need to believe is that these policies are the most effective, the most efficient, the most watertight policies possible. You merely need to believe that they're better than the likely counterfactual, which is countries with long demonstrated histories of not being resilient to global economic shocks, not being able to pay back these debts, having to take on billion-dollar loans in the first place, not being able to make that money back in the future. Which is why the primary contribution from closing opposition is going to be a radical one. It's going to be reading the info slide, listing those policies, and explaining why those policies are of value to these countries, and why they will ensure that they're economically stable into the future. But before I do, firstly, I want to briefly deal with what we hear from opening government. Because opening government essentially identifies some circumstances in which conditions can cause harm. But what they don't identify is that these conditions always lead to harm, or that these policies always generate harm. So that's why the POI I provided them is relevant. Because what I asked them is, why do they opt in then? Given that countries know their own economic conditions and know the situations associated with the loans, why do they willingly opt into a situation that would cause them harm rather than one that would cause them good? Because often they do have multiple suitors. There are bodies like the AIIB, there is China, there are private loans, there are individual governments willing to offer out loans. So why in that marketplace of loans do they opt for the ones with these specifically restrictive conditions? It's because they know that those conditions are A, useful for their country, and B, don't generate the precise kinds of harms that opening government talk about, and they know they won't act in the market, act in the economic ways leading to those harms. They say that, no, actually, they're forced into taking the IMF loans because somehow other loans are more conditional. Like, apparently, Chinese loans are more conditional than IMF loans. Yes, they have higher interest that there has to be paid off on them, but they're certainly not more conditional. China's been trying to badger their way into the international loan market for a long time, which means that taking IMF loans are often actively unpopular, especially given the global history of opposition to the IMF. What does this mean? It means two things. Firstly, it means countries accept these loans when they are in their interest and not when they are not in their interest. But secondly, it also explains the general rationale for why countries are able to opt in, for 3 reasons. Firstly, because countries have an informational asymmetry about themselves. They have access to their banks, they have access to the structures, they know what their history is and they know what their future will be. Secondly, they have access to countervailing advice, not only because of the general set of political opposition that they're likely to face, but also internally, there's often a lot of robust discussion about these loans. But thirdly, we would also tell you that everyone's very well aware of the harms of the IMF and austerity. Like, it's not, hidden that austerity might have some harms. It's not hidden that the IMF has sometimes acted in the interests of the West. These are things that are known quantities. So, what that means is the bar for this government bench is explaining to you why these loans are always bad. Because in the circumstances where they're obviously bad for a country, why wouldn't they just take a loan from another context? Before I get on to moving to explain why our bar is much lower and we need that bar closing.
Look, you would get kicked in the head if your choice was getting kicked in the head or getting kicked in the balls. I don't think your analysis is actually quite as nuanced as it needs to be to land that burden.
I mean, this is just a silly claim, right? Because, like, why do these conditions exist? It's because people want to be repaid, and the best way to be repaid is to ensure that that country has money. Like, why has the IMF been able to be successful for so long? It's because they, to some extent, help countries become solvent. So, let's move on to explain why the specific policies implemented by these conditions are useful. There are 3 identified in the info slide. Firstly, subsidies on fuel going down, and fertilizer of course. Secondly, the currency exchange rate being set to international market rates. And thirdly, market interest rates being good. Sorry, I got those slightly mixed up, but you can read the info slide. You know the one we're talking about. Let's talk about the first. The first thing that I'd like to note is that countries are typically very bad at selecting targets for fertilizer and fuel subsidies. There are 2 large reasons for that. Firstly, capacity. It's very difficult to identify good targets for fertilizer and fuel because these things are based on future speculation where the information is very limited. So even if you have maximal information about the market, it's still highly speculative. But secondly, we also suggest that the incentive of these countries isn't to pick the most economically productive subsidies, but rather they typically just pick the ones that are most politically useful. We can agree with closing government that those can come in the form of poor farmers, but that doesn't mean it's the most economically productive form of subsidies possible. And notably, the comparative is just that other sources of funding exist, right? Like, the government is not the only body with the requisite money to fund things like fertilizer and fuel. And as closing government identified, fertilizer and fuel is a relatively evergreen industry in terms of its profitability, right? Like, everyone always needs fuel and fertilizer, which means that the private industry almost always steps in circumstances where governments don't. That's why in the vast majority of countries, governments have no need to fund this. They only really do it for political gain. Notably, in the context where we are like outside of this immediate 6-month economic shock, which the government bench based their entire case on, prices for fertilizer and fuel are just going to come down. Like, companies still need to profit, they still need to set the prices at a rate that people can actually buy into them in the first place, which means that their harms are basically limited to the next 6 months. Ours are literally all the time after that. And notably, this price inflation will have to drop at some point for the reason just identified. Which means that all this policy does is it gives the government money to invest in literally anything else that might be more economically productive or more societally productive. Like, you take all the money that they're putting into subsidizing fertilizer and fuel, and you just put it into something like hospitals, or you just put it into something like, funding small businesses. That's just money that could be going somewhere else. They need to demonstrate why that trade-off is taken. Secondly, let's talk about the second policy. We think that the currency exchange rate being set to the international rate just insulates countries from shocks. And it's pretty simple, and the economic logic is pretty simple. I'll explain it in a way that the ordinary intelligent voter might understand. So, essentially, what happens is, anytime there is your currency goes down, what happens is your currency also symmetrically becomes cheaper, which means that if people lose confidence, it gives them more capacity to rebuy, which gives them additional confidence that basically counterbalances the risk associated with your currency. So anytime your currency becomes riskier, it also becomes more worth taking on that risk. And what that does is it insulates you from shocks far better, which is relevant for 2 reasons. Firstly, it means we avoid the worst case scenarios with these countries' currencies, directly engaging with closing government. But secondly, it also explains why, in those specific circumstances that are most likely to happen for countries that require massive loans, which are economic shocks, they're able to avoid the worst instances of that happening. Let's move on to the third condition. We think that just market interest rates are just generally good because it allows investors to express a preference for stability via a variety of rates rather than a set government rate. Because notably, a set government rate can't account for each individual loan, whereas when you put it to the market, the creditor is able to set specific rates for specific loans, which allows for preferences to be expressed far more easily. Not only does this make confidence go up, because essentially you're able to have each loan actually match each individual rate that it needs to, but it also means that the market is able to correct for specific circumstances rather than having it being set at a flat rate. So, being the first thing in the debate to actually look at the info slides and give you reasons why they are useful policies, rather than talking about the broad concept of austerity, vote closing opposition.
I thank the Speaker very much for a fantastic speech, and it's my pleasure to call for the government witness and case their side to hear.
CEO is right about one thing. I want everyone in the audience to check your phone and read what the info slide says. The first part of the info slide is about the reasons why they gave out these conditions, the targets and the aims of those conditions. The second part of the info slide is what are those conditions. There were 3 of them. Firstly, reducing or removing fuel subsidies. Secondly, setting interest rates at market rates. Thirdly, making market-based currency exchange rates. Top half confuses the targets with the conditions, and they don't explain why the logic of these targets or these conditions apply those targets. I'll give an example of this. A lot of top half relies on proper austerity, just general austerity analysis, but there's no reason why you couldn't prime the pump under the conditions of these loans. You could take all of this money, and as long as you're not spending it on fucking fuel subsidies, you can spend it on things like giving out, I don't know, like loans to small businesses, but also just things like subsidies for small businesses, like investment in infrastructural programs, investment in educational programs, all those kinds of things. And here's what I deal with opening opposition very briefly on one thing before I return to them later, which is the logic of their analysis only holds if in the absence of these conditions, governments would not be doing austerity policies. Which means that if it is capable for countries to do non-austerity policies under these conditions, they still do non-austerity policies in either case of top half teams, which necessarily implies that neither top half team can derive a direct benefit from the cases that they're granted, meaning by necessity we've already won this debate. Well, see if will also be in here, we'll get to use later. So, 2 things we told you in closing. First thing, which is about currency rates, which is to say that if you, Jack knew this a lot better than me in prep, but the basic idea of it was that like if you have a shitload of foreign currency reserves, no one cares if you collapse because it doesn't really affect them too deeply. And that means that the reason why one of the targets actually did make sense was having high foreign currency reserves. Because the alternative is which is what the stuff that we told you, is that you need to like, I don't know, like you get other people to buy your currency. Jack explained it better. I'll get more under weighing of it. I'm going to weigh the impact of that one. I'll actually understand the second point, so I came up with it. Second one is on collective action, which is basically the idea that like a lot of countries, if they work together, can do some really cool things. You know, you and your neighbours in a particular region of the world might have a particular kind of resource that everyone wants. You might have cheap labour, which everyone wants. You might have cheap products that everyone wants. The problem though is you let every single country go to the market rate of interest rates, they lower them down to the fucking floor because they want as much investment as possible and they don't want anyone else to get it. But if you instead allow them to collectively bargain and to agree with things together, you can get multilateral agreements on setting slightly higher interest rates, which means that people can generate more money because the rate of investment doesn't go down meaningfully. People need to still invest in the region, but you can actually get money on the returns of those things. You get more like returns on your interest rates. How is this beating the rest of the debate? Starting with opening opposition, the first thing they say is that it goes towards elites. It's really good that we keep the anti-corruption condition then, but also I just don't think that this is really comparative. Secondly, that you turn towards China. I think the first thing to say, the main thing to say in this and the turning towards China thing, is I actually just think that a lot of this happens because of geopolitical rather than economic reasons. Oftentimes countries enter into unions with one another based off of the kinds of geopolitical things and soft power that pushes countries to enter into agreements either with the West or with the East, which means that to the extent that this is true, it means that there's not too much of a delta in this kind of thing happening. The third thing to say is you get less money into the IMF's coffers and there's less market confidence, which is kind of the same reason underpinning them. Maybe in the first instance, but we proved that these countries can pay their loans back more because they're generating more revenue for themselves, which means that these IMF loans become a safer bet, right? So the IMF has a higher degree of confidence in the ability of countries to pay back these loans, meaning they can give out more loans, meaning that more people are likely to give money to the IMF because they're confident that countries will pay back their loans. It's also less necessary also for, like there's not as much necessity of money that you can get more money from the country's indigenous production of capital. The fourth thing that I want to note is that they say it's hard to generate money from tax. And this is maybe true, but it's beneficial for us because our case is largely about things like trade, corporation tax, not individual income tax. So the austerity analysis there doesn't apply here. But we're also just able to explain how you just get a better stable economy regardless of those kinds of things. Given that, the way between us and opening opposition should be quite clear, which is that we read the info slide and that we have information that deals with stuff in the info slide and our next are related to the info slide and theirs are not. Opening government then. The first thing I'd like to note on them is that I think the case, as CEO rightfully points out, is to an extent pretty time sensitive. And I think the notion is asking us to go a little bit further than the next 6 months. The second thing to say, and I think that, as I've explained earlier, although we agree with them wholeheartedly on this piece of information, the case is relying on the general austerity stuff that I explained too. The third thing I want to say is that I think a lot of the case in opening government is under-explained. I think the average reform voter has a very different understanding of what the word pegging means compared to others. The fourth thing to say, and this is where they do a good job. They say that subsidies trigger political harms. And I think this is really, really reasonable stuff. The lack of subsidies means you get political unrest. But our case can do this too, because so too does poverty. When you're poor and you don't have a hope in your future, that's when you're more likely to take up guns, when the guys tell you that we can take control over the capital or the resources in these instances. Which means the way in between us and them is pretty straightforward. Which is that firstly, we provide the liquidity for their case to make sense. This is what Jack said. You can give people subsidies. If you have money, we give people money. So we're able to do that. Secondly, our case applies more universally, which is to say that we held out every single person on the ground, even if they wouldn't have been in direct receipt of the subsidies from opening government. And also, I hate to say it again, but we did read the info slide. Last thing then, on closing opposition. They said a couple of things. The first is that countries can choose about themselves, but like a choice between, like, I don't know, if I gave you an option between two hammers to hit you in the head with it, like, that analysis didn't make sense, I'm sorry. Three things then. The first thing they said on subsidies was that, like, well, what if the subsidies are bad, or prices will go down? But, like, the whole response here I want to give to this is, they conceded that fuel has inelastic demand, right? Which, like, is really harmful for their case. Just track the logic of that. The second thing then, on the currency exchange rates, is that they say anytime it goes down, it becomes cheaper, so you buy your currency. But there's two things on this. Firstly, they never explain why you couldn't do this on our side of the house as well, why you couldn't just sell it for market rates if you wanted to, which makes no sense. But second thing then is a lot of people are just worried that what if your currency keeps going down, right? Which is why we need to have the stability analysis that Jack gave you. Because if you're an investor, like, would you buy Bitcoin now? Probably not. Third thing that I'm interested in is before I do opening opposition.
It's not exactly a mystery how setting the market exchange rate keeps currencies stable, and it's even stranger to say that the average poor voter understands your extension about the World Bank and bonds.
So, firstly, like, read the notes. Jack actually did explain a lot of that material, right? And the second thing is, like, I actually just don't think the average poor voter does know the things. You ever met the average poor voter? Like, I think that's really strange. Obviously, my analysis there on top of it, I think the implication of it was I think a lot of the information was too brief and not brought up to the full mechanistic extent to be able to credit the point. I was using a shorthand for it. Last thing then on interest rates is, like, I just really didn't understand the point on interest rates here. Like, I mean, the whole point of our case was that governments, if they want to, can set higher interest rates when they can do mutually beneficial agreements in order to be able to get more money out of those things. So I'm not sure what the analysis here on interest rates was, because the whole thrust of our case, in essence, is that the market is exploitative because it causes competition between people. And if you're not within that competition, allowed to create leverage and mutual cooperation within groups of people who have mutual benefits, all that leads to is a race to the bottom. And that is what happens with the IMF, right? Which is that the history of colonialism happens in a new font. You tell different countries that they cannot look to what their neighbours are doing, they must go towards the market rate. But the history of the markets has always been exploitation for the poorest individuals in the world. We give money back to the hands of those who are able to do things. We strengthen these international organisations and mutual agreements in ways that make these countries able to escape debt and poverty over the course of their lives. I'm very proud to propose.
And it's my pleasure to call on the opposition whip from Case Side as a whole. Yeah.
The important concession made by the government bench is that they recognise that these countries will eventually need to pay back loans. That is, they rely on solvency for stability, they rely upon a credit score or at least reputation among creditors in order to achieve things like development. And the reason that's such a large problem for the government bench is that they provide no alternative way for that solvency to occur. And instead, they spend all their time explaining why, in the worst case scenario, where these policies are pursued, in the worst case possible, harms arise. That's why our extension is so important, because it explains to you on the specifics, i.e. what is happening in the motion, these policies are, firstly, not so extremely counter-secular to destroy the economy, and secondly, pretty efficient at restoring things like stability. I'm going to add one thing to that extension at the start of my speech, which is to explain, in addition to the question mark added to, like, what were provided by the government bench. That is, we are given no indication as to how they would deal with these problems. The additional thing to note there is there are a series of reasons to think that in fact these alternatives
Yeah,
could be crafted pretty poorly. Yeah, sure.
My entire case was how you get more money in terms of both solvency and liquidity. That's how we deal with those problems.
Oh, yeah. So I'm going to deal with your case mechanistically, not on the impact. I know that that's your impact. Let me rebut your case before you waste the deal. So, the two problems with their alternative is the first thing is it's extremely hard to formulate the balance of bond payments that CG relies on, or the balance of kind of cutbacks to secular spending that OG relies upon, and they assume a huge amount of the work can just be done fairly easily. That is the only information we have about these countries, is that they are in severe amounts of debt. Sure, there are reasons to think that the economy at large can put them in that position. That is things like wars, that is things like shocks to commodity prices. But we would say the only indicator we have for these countries is that at the moment, they've A, failed to respond to any of these crises on their own, and B, probably weren't in a very strong financial situation to begin with. We will note that these types of policies also rely upon other actors responding to your policies well, right? And there's no indication given as to why, just because the numbers might add up, people have the confidence to engage in the policies of a country that has shown itself to be poorly managing itself thus far. The second thing we prove in our member speech is that often these decisions are subject to huge amounts of political pressure. The only response to that we get is from CG, where they note that, oh, well, that's why we have these corruption mechanisms in place. But we point out that often these decisions aren't being made corruptly, they're being made ineptly. That is, you need to rely on some people to get elected. That is, you need to rely on some people to form a coalition. And that's what creates the problem. It's not corruption, it's politics being poor at creating the solutions that you need. What do you know then as the sum of our extension? We explain two things. The first is that not only do we not have a strong conception of what the government bench's approach is, but there are also reasons to think it's incredibly difficult to form these sorts of policies, implement them, and have people confidently engage with them. Secondly, we provide you the reasons in our member speech to think that the policies in front of us are actually pretty good ones, both at dealing with debt and at dealing with the instability that exists. I'm going to deal now with the two responses we get to the extension from CG. Their first response is just, well, demand for fuel is inelastic, but it misses the point of our argument. What we explain to you is that new markets are always valuable for corporations. That is, they get a first mover advantage by negotiating a more affordable deal. Even if their kind of margin goes down, they still make a profit selling to you, so affordability is valuable. And so outside of the immediate context of a commodity crisis, and in the medium term, there's no reason to think that this kind of inelasticity problem is anywhere meaningful. The second thing they say, and this is also to their credit, like part of OG's case, is floating leads to instability. But the problem there is twofold. The first thing to note is they misunderstand the fact that unlike something like Bitcoin, countries have underlying value to their economy. That is, people have more confidence in the solvency of a country, even where things are looking bad, where they actually have productive capacity, where they actually have people, where they actually have things like land. And that explains why even the price of enduring a short-term shock actually gives the reason for investors to maintain their confidence. That is, even if the risk goes up, by the very virtue of that, the price has come down. And that explains why, in our worst case scenario, the sorts of shocks to consumers' ability to buy imports and inflation that opening governments spend so much time on are, at our worst case, short-term harms. And in reality, it's much better to focus on the solvency than it is to worry about things like that. So that should deal with the kind of primary tax we get to our line of extension and explain to you why, in the comparison between question mark, and a real set of policies, these sets of policies are pretty reasonable. Next, let's move on to closing government. Their claim essentially goes like this. Foreign currency reserves make people care less about your collapse and remove the ability to kind of engage in these mutually assisted relationships, to which there are two problems. The first thing to note is that even where you have foreign currency reserves, it's still bad for the international community for your country to collapse. That is, you lose a whole host of other opportunities where a country collapses. Even if they have foreign currency reserves, you lose investment opportunities, you lose trade opportunities. Perhaps this country is important in some diplomatic fashion. There's just a range of other reasons to think you don't want a country to collapse. And just on a sensibility check, just having foreign currency reserves isn't a strong reason to throw a country to the wolves. But secondly, I'd point out the hidden premise of this case is that the level of foreign currency solvency you have is sufficient for the financial implications on other countries to be minimal, and that is just not a reasonable interpretation of what building up foreign currency reserves mean. This country needs to spend lots of money helping its people. This country does not have much money. That explains to you why this level of solvency, which would bring about all harms and kind of neglects that they explain, is extremely unlikely.
If these policies are good, this is an argument for market reforms in 3 years, not during a crisis. As the info site says, it is all policies and states have good incentives to trickle down because they don't want a revolution and political collapse as we preempt.
Oh, yeah. So I'll move on to you now. The harms you describe do not eventuate but for the most extreme versions of our policies, right? Like reducing the deficit doesn't mean instant mega austerity, right? Like you can, and that is where most of your harms come from. Like instability, people rioting, like I know that instant austerity is a bad idea. I would say that most of these governments know. But secondly, we point out that the market of loans, which exists, provides the incentive for groups like China, who wants to buy influence, or private investors who want to buy prestige, or like, kind of market reputation to give, which not only flips a bunch of your material about how these loans are bad, but actually gives us one of the only pieces of limited information that we have about these loan agreements, which is that these countries opted in. So that kind of deals with most of your case, but I'll also point out you also make an important concession, which is that you need to avoid collapse in the short term, which explains why you also need to do something anti-secular in the short term. You don't give us what that is, we defend what we are forced to defend. Finally, let's deal with OO. They say, well, debt is bad. I just point out this is the less valuable contribution because the government teams conceded. The more valuable contribution is to explain why the policies in front of us are good ways at dealing with that problem, which is the way we uniquely describe. And secondly, this speaks to the broader opening half problem, which kind of knocks them out of the debate, which they both set up extremes of collapse versus austerity, like mega austerity, and then they both walk into the middle, noting that they need a bit of both. That's why you should vote. Pleasure.